Prepare for an unforgettable journey where we dive into the most thrilling space exploration updates. With each passing day, new missions and discoveries push the boundaries of what we know about the cosmos. From NASA's latest breakthroughs to groundbreaking technologies that will define the future of space travel, this video takes you right to the heart of humanity's quest to understand the universe. Join us as we explore the unknown.
With returning astronauts to the surface of the moon for the first time since Apollo just around the corner, we have a lot to look forward to in the coming years with regards to spaceflight. Despite delays and budget issues, there is still every reason to believe that we will have men back on the surface of the moon by the end of the decade. President Trump's new NASA administrator, private astronaut Jared Isaacman, has already indicated that he plans on pushing through with the current Artemis program to the point where it can be reasonably replaced by an alternative such as Starship. NASA has many missions, both manned and unmanned, planned for the coming years. Europa Clipper is one that is currently en route to its destination, Europa, the icy moon of Jupiter, that is suspected to have an ocean underneath its frozen surface. NASA has a flying probe to Saturn's largest moon, Titan, called Dragonfly, that is planned to be launched in the next few years to explore Titan within its atmosphere and look at the lakes of methane on its surface. NASA's most notable mission moving forward is the Artemis II flight, which would fly astronauts around the moon for the first time since Apollo 17. This is a major step forward in returning to the moon. The hardware for this flight is well advanced and is currently being stacked in the vehicle assembly building at the Kennedy Space Center. It is far enough along that it would take a major shift in policy for this flight not to fly on the current vehicle. One of the difficulties of SLS Orion is keeping it economically viable until a more economical vehicle such as Starship can take its place. One thing that makes SLS Orion sustainable for several flights is the fact that it is using existing shuttle hardware at this time. It would at least give Starship several years to become a viable vehicle for carrying crews, not only from Earth to orbit, but to the moon and back, and do so more economically. For years now, SpaceX has been launching crewed Dragon missions to the International Space Station. In fact, they are the primary way that U.S. astronauts go to the International Space Station at this point in time. As amazing as Falcon 9 Dragon has been with its recovery and reuse of the first stage, compared to Starship, which is ultimately going to be fully reusable and far more powerful, it is practically nothing. Furthermore, SpaceX's Starship is a critical component in the Artemis moon landings, since it is the vehicle intended to land the crews on the moon during the first couple of flights, as well as others. If SpaceX is allowed to continue unhampered, there is no reason why Lunar Starship could not be ready to bring men to the lunar surface within the next couple of years. Furthermore, there is definite evidence that they are working on its development. Furthermore, once Starship is fully developed to the point of being ready to launch crews into orbit and to the moon by itself, it would make an excellent replacement for SLS Orion because it would be far more economical. One extra motivation for the United States returning to the moon by 2030 is that China has stated its intentions of landing a manned mission on the moon before 2030 as well. Unlike the United States, China has yet to test its launch vehicle and spacecraft in actual flight. The closest they have come has been a launch abort system test, which would not have needed to include a fully functional vehicle. They do, however, have actual flight hardware under construction, indicating that they are getting ready for an actual test flight. However, it is still quite possible that Artemis II could send a crew around the moon before this test flight gets off the ground. Barring any major delays in Artemis II, in order to beat this flight in sending a crew around the moon, the Chinese would not only have to launch this test mission before Artemis II, but they would have to do so with a crew on board. One area where the United States and China seem to be on a fairly equal plane is the development of the spacesuit that will be worn on the surface of the moon. In both cases, the development of the lunar suit is pretty far along. They are at least far enough along where they can be tested with a human being wearing the suit, even if it is with an external power and oxygen supply. The discoveries of the James Webb telescope since its launch could fill dozens of videos of this size. However, one of the most important ones are some of the distant galaxies that it has discovered. Among the most notable discoveries by the James Webb Space Telescope comes in the form of some extremely distant galaxies that it has discovered. These galaxies are so highly structured that they actually cause problems for the Big Bang cosmology, because such highly structured galaxies should not exist that close to the time that the Big Bang is alleged to have occurred. When it comes to private spaceflight, SpaceX is the king because it has actually flown several totally private orbital missions with its Dragon spacecraft. Blue Origins has a suborbital private manned spacecraft that it has flown several times with people on board, allowing them to experience several minutes of weightlessness. There have also been private missions to the moon, including landings, opening the door further towards return of humans to the moon. The International Space Station has been continuously inhabited by an international crew of astronauts and cosmonauts for the last 20 years. However, it is nearing the end of its lifetime and will have to be replaced. Currently, China has its own space station in orbit, and Russia is planning on building its own. There are several designs for private space stations that are currently in the process of being constructed. This includes the Axiom Space Station, which will be constructed on the International Space Station and then separate from it before the International Space Station is deorbited. The single biggest technological innovation by SpaceX has been the regular recovery and reuse of first-stage rocket on its Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. They are working to continue this line of innovation by making their Starship spacecraft fully reusable. Progress in this direction is being made, with Flight 9 being the first time they plan on reusing a Super Heavy booster. The ultimate goal is not just reusability, but rapid reusability, which means that the same booster and orbital vehicle could fly multiple times a day. This type of technological innovation will not only make orbital refueling possible, but practical. The number one source of delays and setbacks has been developing the rockets necessary to do the job. SLS also suffers from bureaucratic issues where congressmen are trying to make sure that contracts are in their district. However, SpaceX has also had its share of developmental challenges and setbacks with Starship, simply because Version 2 has had problems with the second stage surviving to the end of its burn. SpaceX has and continues to use rapid development efforts to test to see what works, rather than simply doing stuff on paper. One of the biggest causes of setbacks has been the cost-plus contracting that is being used on SLS and some of its related systems. This is a problem that could be alleviated by going with the flat rate contracting that SpaceX has been working with. One concern that some people have expressed is about choosing between either returning to the moon or going on to Mars. However, this is not an either-or situation. On the contrary, returning to the moon is an important step in eventually going on to Mars. First of all, the gravity on the moon is about half that of Mars, and the conditions on the moon are a lot harsher than on Mars because the moon has absolutely no atmosphere. However, the moon is only 3 days away from Earth, meaning that in an emergency, a crew can return at any point. However, even with a nuclear fission rocket, Mars is going to be months away at best. This makes the moon the perfect place to learn to live off the Earth and to live off the land of the planet that we are on. Furthermore, we can learn to deal with the lower gravity. Put simply, except for the extra travel time, once we learn to live on the moon without having to get resources from the Earth, doing so on Mars will be relatively easy. This makes returning to the moon a critical part of any plan on eventually going to Mars. In conclusion, if all goes well, the next few years are going to be very exciting in spaceflight as we pick up where we left off with Apollo. However, this time, the moon is not going to be the end game, but rather it is going to be a place where we are going to learn to live on another planetary body, but one that we are close enough to Earth that in an emergency, astronauts can return to Earth. This makes returning to the moon a critical stepping stone in going on to Mars and possibly even the other planets.